Once upon a time, in a distant land called the interweb, there lived a lone traveler. He traversed the interweb, sharing his silly contrarian opinions with all who would listen. His name was the Final Fantasizer. This is a chapter from his story. Greetings, and well met, dear traveler of the internet. I am the Final Fantasizer, a shallow, opinionated contrarian and one of the ugliest critics on the web. Welcome to the first video I've ever uploaded to this YouTube channel. And what better way to start my career as an internet movie and video game critic than with controversy. In this series of rants, in this series of video essays, I will show carefully and thoroughly that Final Fantasy VI is nowhere near as perfect as some fans and critics claim. In fact, I intend to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that the game has become massively overrated in the last 15 to 20 years. In my eyes, Final Fantasy VI is indeed the definition of the word overrated. I do like the game, however, and while I'd personally rate it an 8 out of 10 and not a 10 out of 10 like almost everyone else, it is overall better than the sum of its parts, a lot of which fall on the weak side when taken individually. Which brings us to the main topic of today's video, Kefka, and why he isn't a great villain. As it happens, Kefka is often brought up as one of the main arguments for why FF6 is great, or the greatest Final Fantasy, or even the greatest video game of all time. A lot of fans and critics say that Kefka is not just the best Final Fantasy villain, but the best video game villain ever. This idea needs to be challenged, and that's what I am here to do. To show that Kefka is not the amazing and best ever villain that so many folks claim he is, I will look at some of the most common arguments presented by fans and critics alike that aim to prove his awesomeness, and I will respond to them. The arguments I intend to counter and debunk come from the following sources. Kotaku.com's article titled Why Final Fantasy VI is Kefka is the best video game villain of all time. Mojoplays video titled The Greatest Video Game Villain of All Time. Xenoflux Raiders video titled Why is Kefka Such a Good Villain? And Broguelike's video titled Kefka vs Sephiroth, Who is the Better Final Fantasy Villain? I chose the first three sources because they're all popular based on the amount of comments, views and likes, and because they include most of the arguments commonly used to argue for Kefka's greatness. And I also included Broguelike's video because unlike the other three, he actually takes a more analytical, in-depth and really well-articulated look at Kefka, even if I think his arguments don't necessarily support his conclusions very well. His video is excellent, and you ought to go and watch it and give him a thumbs up, regardless of if you like Kefka or not. He really has put a lot of effort into presenting his case, and I cannot help but appreciate the clarity with which he makes his points. Let's start with the Mojoplays video, and then move on to the statements made by the author Richard Eisenbeis in his article at Kotaku.com, as the arguments presented in those two sources are the most vacuous and thus the easiest to debunk. Mojoplays video on Kefka begins building their case for the Mad Jester's greatness by introducing what is essentially a box-ticking exercise. They list a bunch of characteristics they claim a great villain must possess, and of course, those are all characteristics that Kefka does possess to a lesser or greater degree. To put it at its mildest, this is a weak argument. My suspicion is that the authors of the video like Kefka so much that they looked at his attributes and then claimed that those were exactly the attributes that must be there for a villain to be truly great. Essentially, they probably worked backwards from Kefka's personality and not the other way around, which in my opinion is cheating. Here are the items on their list. According to Mojoplays, a great villain must A. Be driven by a desire to create chaos. B. Be larger than life and able to dominate their foes as if they were ants. C. Be ambitious enough to threaten not just individuals, but cities, empires, and entire worlds. D. Be relentless and pursue their goals for years or even decades. E. Be admirably intelligent. And F. Be so evil that it is almost admirable. These rules of villainy are so arbitrary that it's ridiculous. Just think about this. Do any of the first three, that is, half the rules on Mojoplays list, apply to all or any villains that are classic serial killer types? What if someone was to make a game based on Thomas Harris's Hannibal Lecter novels? Hannibal Lecter is neither an agent of chaos, nor a superhuman capable of wiping out his enemies like ants. He's also not a threat to any empire and possesses no power to wipe out all the life forms on Earth, or any planet for that matter. According to Mojoplays, Hannibal Lecter is therefore nowhere close to being a great villain. What about Michael Corleone from the Godfather films, or similar mob bosses in video games? They're intelligent and pursue their desires relentlessly, but they too can't wipe out nations and aren't driven by a need for chaos, rather by a need to exercise more control over everyone around them. Or let's look at it from another angle, the aliens from Independence Day. What if they just happened to be in a video game? They certainly threatened entire cities and nations, thrust the entire world into chaos, dominated the enemy for a large portion of the story, pursued their interests for a long time, even returning in a sequel 20 years later. They were intelligent enough for interstellar travel, and they were so evil that they originally weren't even going to bother explaining why they wanted humanity dead, simply telling us they want us to die. That's right, when looking at Mojoplays' rules of villainy, it appears we ought to consider the Independence Day aliens better villains than Hannibal Lecter or Michael Corleone. That's insane. But this is what happens when you work backwards from a villain that you like and don't pause even for a minute to consider what actually makes a good villain. Of course, what actually makes a good villain is good writing. And a good villain can be an agent of chaos or someone obsessed with order. A good villain can be someone who threatens entire planets or someone who only pursues a main character that we care about. Mojoplays' lazily conjured box-ticking exercise that is meant to make Kefka look epic fails miserably. Once we understand the simple truth that a great villain need not tick boxes of traits, he or she simply has to be well written. To completely drive this point home, here is a list of characteristics that some famous evildoers have that Kefka does not possess. A. The ability to psychologically and emotionally manipulate both their followers and the public. B. The ability to turn brother against brother and make friends betray each other. C. The ability to use impractically long swords or a general proficiency with weapons. D. The ability to hide their true identity from all potential threats. And E. The ability to come back from the dead. There you go. According to my list, which is just as arbitrary as Mojoplays' list was, Kefka scores a 0 out of 5, and is thus an awfully written villain that nobody should fear. And if I'm being honest, I actually think my list is better, but whatever, that's not the point. Let's move on to Mojoplays' second argument and third argument. I will tackle these two in one go because Mojo peoples have put so little effort into making their case that the second and third arguments actually contradict each other. Argument 2 begins with, Kefka is difficult to narrow down due to the complexity of his character, and his unpredictable nature makes him all the more off-putting. Argument number 3, however, concludes with, Kefka is a broken man that becomes a vengeful god, and the outcome plays out exactly as you'd expect from someone so shattered. So my question to Mojoplays is, which is it? Is Kefka unpredictable, or does he cause harm in exactly the manner you'd expect him to, making him wholly predictable? And by the way, that Mojo video has an over 90% like ratio. I mean, do gamers and critics who love FF6 even think about what they're saying when hyping Kefka up? Do Kefka fans even care that the arguments made for his supposed awesomeness make sense? Or do they just blindly nod and applaud whenever someone states that Kefka is the best, even when the arguments not only do not support the conclusion, but directly contradict one another? Apparently it's the second option. How else to explain that Mojoplays' scripted and illustrated video contradicts itself within the span of 80 seconds when trying to praise Kefka? It honestly boggles the mind. Of course, the first claim, that of Kefka being unpredictable, doesn't hold up on its own either. Kefka is indeed wholly predictable. All he does in the game is cause as much harm as is within his power to cause from the moment the game introduces him to the moment he wins. First, he has Terra burn down soldiers. Then he orders his soldiers to commit genocide by burning Figaro Castle. Then he commits genocide by poisoning Doma Castle. Then he kills all the Espers he can kill, and then finally destroys and murders half of the world by moving the goddess statues. That's not unpredictability. That's a consistent pattern of destruction and mayhem, and it's one of two patterns of behavior we can see in Kefka. The second being how he continually runs away from fights whenever he's in a losing position. Kefka might just be the most predictable villain in the series in terms of how he behaves. Mojoplays' video isn't just wrong, it borders on being an attempted lie. In the interest of fairness, let's also spell out the rest of Mojoplays' second argument, which says that Kefka is not just crazy, he has a point. Life can be unfair. It's the depths of his bitter, nihilistic pessimism that set him apart from other villains. He despises life itself. First of all, life is unfair isn't exactly a brilliant and groundbreaking observation. Loads of people have discovered this to be the case since the dawn of time. Secondly, Kefka's famous quote, "Why do people insist on creating things that will inevitably be destroyed? Why do people cling to life knowing that they must someday die?" isn't impressive either. Why bother putting in effort when we will all die in the end? Sounds like something a 14-year-old emo kid would scribble on his desk when he's bored in class. And I'm not trying to mock or belittle Kefka when I say this, I'm simply pointing out that unlike what Mojoplays claims, Kefka isn't really a deep and complex character at all. He makes the most basic of observations, but fails to put his own spin on any of them. He offers no potential solutions to his own questions, and no insight into why life is meaningless or unfair. It's all just very basic stuff. Is it unfair to expect Kefka to be as well written as Yevgeny Bazarov from Fathers and Sons, or to expect him to have as deep an understanding of nihilism as Nietzsche or Heidegger? Well, yes, obviously, Kefka is just a 1994 video game villain, but remember that it is not me trying to push Kefka as a deep and unpredictable character that's difficult to narrow down due to his complexity. I'm just here to bust the myth that Kefka is the greatest bad guy of all time. Mojoplays' third argument for Kefka's ultimate greatness also states that the ease with which he commits atrocities with no regard for human life is the key factor why Kefka is the greatest villain. I don't understand this argument at all. It sounds like a non sequitur to me. Why should we consider a villain who kills people without remorse a better villain than one who makes himself feel every death he has caused? In my opinion, both types of villains can be equally well written or poorly written. This feels like Mojoplays added another box to their earlier argument about character traits, nothing more. It's not a good argument, and it wouldn't convince anyone who doesn't already really like Kefka. And with that, I believe it's time to end part 1 of this series. Please join me in the next episode, where I will take a look at Kotaku.com and Genoflux Raiden's arguments for Kefka's greatness, and we'll debunk the idea that Kefka's victory moment makes him the best villain. Farewell, my fellow travelers of the interweb.